So perspective is going to be the first thing we cover. The second thing is primitive forms. Everything that you ever want to draw can be broken down and reconstructed using primitive forms and then adding the detail after the fact. So we're going to establish primitive forms, which you can only do accurately if you understand perspective. The third is contouring and solid drawing. So those of you who have who are either currently enrolled in illustrated characters or did it last year, you'll know a little bit about what I mean by solid drawing. It's essentially the construction, maybe the contouring, the draw through. And then the fourth thing is more of a slight aesthetic thing, where we're looking at how do we communicate depth in a drawing through very simple techniques such as line weight, and how you intentionally place line weight in order to communicate depth. Okay, so I have got some old resources from, well, they're not old, they're useful resources from a drawing class that I did for a bridge course for the uni, and a lot of this is really key. I will try to create like maybe a place to share some of these resources, but hopefully through your exercises that we go through today, you'll be able to remember them and just replicate them. So 1 point perspective, I'm not going to cover because that one's a little bit more intuitive, but I will very briefly just describe perspective in general. So we're using the horizon line and we're using vanishing points. 1 point perspective means one vanishing point, 2 point perspective means two vanishing points, and then the higher up you go, obviously, the more vanishing points are used. When we get to 3 point perspective, that usually means a vertical influence for that, for the vertical lines. So we will look at that as well when we do some primitive forms in a second. 2 point perspective is what I'm going to get us to focus on in the first exercise. It eliminates the slightly more complex third vanishing point, which is somewhere in the vertical axis. And we're just going to focus on some vanishing points on that horizon line. So this is a bit hard to see, but essentially what we're going to do is go through these steps together and create a map of forms, which will look. So we're going to create a field of cubes using 2 point perspective. Sorry, that took a hot minute. Sweet. So how are we going to do that? We're going to walk through it together. Righty-ho. So we start with creating that horizon line. For the purpose of this first kind of round of doing this exercise, I recommend doing your horizon line in that lower third. If you really want to challenge yourself, and this is a bit more familiar territory, you can do a horizon line slightly higher up or in the center. It's going to be up to you. I'm just going to do something that's a bit more familiar to our human eye. Okay, once we have our horizon line, we want to establish the vanishing points. I'm going to have them on the far ends. And this is going to be where all of our directional lines are going to come from or be influenced by. So I'm going to create a new layer just so that I've got a bit more freedom. I'm going to just change my color as well so you can see, maybe pink. And we're going to start by drawing a line vertically anywhere in the space. So we just need to do one for now. If you're working in Photoshop or, well, I don't know for anything else, but if you're working in Photoshop, if you hold Shift, it will create a straight line. Otherwise, just kind of approximate a straight line. It doesn't really matter too much. Depends on how accurate you want to be. Once we have that line, we can start to draw out from our vanishing point to the two ends of our line. So you can either freehand it if you want to, get somewhere in the ballpark like I have, or you can use shift again to kind of tap and tap. And I'll just show you how that works, but I do need to change my brush in order to do that. If I go to hard round, if I tap, hold shift, tap, I can get a line going out. That is massive. I'm going to just change my brush size. So tap, hold it, tap, oops, like that, holding shift. Is that confusing? So you hit somewhere, hold shift, hit somewhere else, and it'll draw a straight line. And we do the same with the bottom, and we do the same to the other vanishing point. Now we've got a little bit more structure. So you can see where from here, we could draw the other two sides of our cube. Doesn't really matter where you want. If you wanted to do it more of an oblong, you can. If you wanted to do it really thin, that's fine too. It doesn't really matter where you do it because it'll look correct. Everyone following along okay with this so far? Cool. Okay, so now we want to do the same thing with the bottom lines from, for the new lines. So at the bottom, I'm going to connect it to that vanishing point, just like that. Is that easy to see? Those colors? And again, from the opposite end. And now we've got the floor of our cube. So this may seem pretty basic, but after a while, you won't need to rely so much on all of these construction lines, and you'll be able to freehand it quite easily yourself. But if you're ever struggling with getting that accuracy, you can always fall back on this construction method and you'll be able to create them. So if we were introducing a third vanishing point, which would be vertical, just going to do a bit of backtracking. Usually the third vanishing point would be actually way off the canvas. Otherwise it will look really, really warped. So if you look at a cityscape, all of the buildings will be, from your perspective, exactly where your eyes are, will be meeting a vanishing point way up in the atmosphere. So this drawing is going to look very warped and weird, but just know that that's kind of normal. If we move our other vanishing points in a little closer, it might seem a little bit better. So I'm going to move mine over here now, and we're going to work in this 3-point system. So it's a really, really tall pyramid. All right, from there, I'm going to draw a line vertically, but this time we're using that third vanishing point as our point of reference. So if I draw a straight line from there, somewhere in here, I can use that as my starting point. So I'm just going to use the eraser and cut back a bit of that information. So this is now our starting line. And then the same technique applies. So we draw from our vanishing point. I'll change the color. We draw from our vanishing point to the lines. And what the difference between the previous example and this one is that these new lines that we're introducing based on those are going to be converging at that vertical third position. So like this. And now we've got a direction. We're heading in a certain way. And we do the same thing with the new lines. We connect them to those vanishing points. If we make a new layer and draw over all of this construction very quickly, just to show you. We have a very forced perspective cube. Like I said, these vanishing points in a normal setting would be much further away. But you can see how, if we looked at it from a ground plane and a grid, that this is kind of looking up and underneath. Ignore that last one, that was terrible. But you can see how we're looking up from underground to a city, for example. and that all those buildings will be going in that direction. So that brings me on to my next point, grids. Grids, once you start to freehand perspective, are going to be a really useful tool. We've mentioned grids in the past if you did storyboarding in second year, but I'm just going to rehash that very quickly with you now. So we're going to be, just backtracking. Please continue to do other cubes for that exercise to create a big field of them, like in that early example, and you'll have a whole bunch of them. I'm not going to make you do that right now, just because we've got to move on to the next steps, but I highly recommend doing this exercise every other month just for the fun of it, because it is actually kind of fun drawing shapes in space, but I'll let you finish that. Okay, so grids. Grids can be a really tricky one to draw, but they create the groundwork for creating your own perspective freehand. So when I draw a grid, I'll always start with 2 lines going in opposite directions. And that is going to help me visualize where these vanishing points are going to be. So we're working still in vanishing points, but for this exercise, we're now looking at the ground. We're not looking at the horizon line. The horizon line doesn't exist on this canvas. We're looking at the ground, but we still get a sense that there's a vanishing point way off there and way off there. And there's a vanishing point way off there that continues and continues. It doesn't really matter which direction it is, they'll be the same. And then from there, I'll draw a secondary line, and this will be like, oh, okay, so my vanishing point is somewhere in the middle of these 2 lines, and I can kind of eyeball the angle that the other lines are going to come from so that they all look like they're going to eventually end up in the same convergence point. Yeah, does that make sense? It's a bit of a different concept, but it's the same principle. And then from the other side, oh, I want to keep that previous one. Hold on. Ugh. From the other side, we do the same thing. We add a second line, and now I know, okay, so the vanishing point is somewhere off in the center of these 2 points. Now let me try and eyeball the adjacent lines. So something like this. The point of doing this is that I've now created a series of overlapping lines that are going to help me inform where those vanishing points are, so I can construct a drawing based on this. You can apply this with a horizon line in this space as well, which I will also show you for those of you who are about to go into key scenes. It's really important information. So for now, let's work with this example. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw based on this. So if I'm going to draw a cube, we're going to go back to primitive forms just for now. I'm going to draw lines based on the angle that I've established with my grid. That way, vertical doesn't really matter because the 3rd vanishing point is so far up in the distance, it doesn't matter to me. And now my top lines are following that line that I've established right there, and the same with that bottom one. So you see how using a grid creates these parameters? Does that make sense as well? I'm getting silence, but yeah, hopefully that makes sense. Okay, good. Now let's apply the same principle, but using a horizon line, because I know that that's what some of you are interested in knowing. Okay. So has everyone got that image in mind? We're going to move on to the next example. Yeah. So horizon line. I'm going to chuck it in that bottom 3rd again, just to keep consistent. Oops, here's my canvas. I'm going to draw my grid based on here. So with a with a horizon line in the mix, the grid will look like it goes off into the distance, that it has some depth. So what I recommend is still draw those lines. I usually start with 1. I've established that there's a vanishing point immediately through that process, and I can have lines branch off from that point that will gradually become narrower or closer together, the closer they get to that horizon line, because it's going off into the distance. We're emulating that. If I do the same on the other side, it's just kind of radiating out from there like a sun. And we've got that ground plane established like that. So for your other vanishing point, you may want to have it exist off canvas. It might look more natural, but you can also do it on canvas if you prefer. If you want to do something that's quite intense, like if you were looking at the corner of a building on a city street and you wanted to look out to do two different directions, two different streets, that could be a good technique to have the vanishing point on there. But for this, I'm going to pretend that it's way off in the distance and just have a line go across and approximate where that vanishing line will be, somewhere way off that way. So I can approximate those other lines based on that. And again, they're going to get tighter and tighter the closer they get to hitting that vanishing point. This one is a little bit trickier. I highly recommend practicing this, just doing a series of horizon lines and adding grids. It's going to really benefit environment drawings to create that groundwork. When I'm doing storyboarding, every single panel, I will establish a grid without question. It always happens, and it makes my life so much easier. I don't have to think about my perspective at all. So if you wanted to, you could even apply a sky grid. I'm going to change to gray just for contrast. I'm still going to have that vanishing point here. And I'm just going to, typically with a sky, I'll make it a little bit broader just to not mess with it. And then maybe a slightly curved vanishing point kind of grid thing. Just so that I've got that dome effect that the atmosphere naturally has. So this is a really good setup, a really good way to get yourself ready to apply those perspective techniques to your forms, which brings us on to the next step, primitive forms. By primitive forms, I mean things like cubes, cones, pyramids, spheres, ellipses. They're all those core foundational forms that help with construction. The reason why I got you to do a field of cubes is because if you break something down into cubes, it's really easy to add curvature information, which I'll show you in some of my slides. Yes, that worked. Okay. Feels like we're covering a lot really quickly, but again, these are just tools and you want to practice them yourself. Okay, so primitive forms, like I said, cube, pyramid, cylinder, cone, sphere, are really easy to construct once you get a handle on that perspective quality. But for now, let's just strip it back. We're not doing all of the, if any of you have ever done graphic design in terms of drawing, graphic drawing design, you'll know that there's many different structural techniques and construction techniques to make everything as absolutely spot on as you can. But because we're quick drawers, we're concept people, we want to get things down fast, we're just going to shave off all of that stuff and strip it back. So this is my technique. Well, it is a technique that you can use to construct these forms really quickly by starting with a single plane. So cylinders and cones have an ellipse, and then a sphere. Obviously, you'll start with a circle. The other two, just a plane. So yeah, just an edge or face, if we're thinking about in 3D terms, with those perspective vanishing points happening. If you want to make it jazzy, establish where that center is, draw out from there and create the form. I'm not going to make you do this now because I'm actually trying to make up time. but I will share this resource for you so that you can do this exercise yourself. And I'll show you what that could look like. I will show you, however, ellipses, because that's something that a lot of students struggle with. How do I draw something that has curvature like a pillar in a scene without the perspective being weird? Because a lot of the time we'll see that base shape look a little strange. So let's do this in order to figure out how we draw a circle, and then we can apply this exact same technique on an angle. So I'll show you what that looks like. Let's jump back over to drawing. So we want to just make a square. It doesn't really matter if it's not perfectly square just for this exercise, but try and get it somewhat uniform. From there, we draw corner to corner, and then from the corner, you draw side to side or center to center, so that you have a series of wedges. And then from there, you mark your approximation of the third points. So 1/3 in and 1/3 away from the edge. It doesn't have to be perfect. You'll kind of be able to eyeball very minor changes later. So I've marked all of my thirds. Sorry. Just going to make it slightly more square because mine was pretty wide. Right, and then what were we doing? Oh yeah, connecting all those lines. So from here, make a new line, new layer, new color. What we can do to make a circle is connect the edge points with these 1/3 of the way in points. And you can get it a little rough and sketchy if you would like to, that's fine. And then we've got a circle. Look at that, beautiful, stunning work, if I might say. The reason why I'm showing you this is because if we want to apply this on a ground plane, so for example, if we've drawn that grid from earlier, we can apply that same method. So let's do just that. Is everyone ready for me to move on, or just a second longer on that one? This one's a little harder, yeah, but it's worth it. You'll see why in a second. Yours might not look perfectly circle. That's fine. Mine never do. I always just, I do this until I get it right. Over and over and over. And then I'm like, oh yeah, that one looks okay. Let me just keep that one. Yeah. But that's just me personally, because I don't have patience. But if you were doing a, let me just show you. If you were doing something like this, where you were creating a pretty hardcore realistic concept, you can apply that method in that context. So you see why people do this in a slightly more mathematical way. We're just using it a little bit for accuracy. What we're going to do now is using our grids or just creating a new plane. We're going to do that same technique and create a pillar together. So it's exactly the same. It's just fallen onto the ground. So there's a little bit more perspective in it. So how am I doing? Yeah, it's fine. Okay, so if I'm using my grid as an example, I'm going to draw, create a new plane, a new layer. My God, all of these buzzwords are just floating around. I need a color that you can see. Okay, so I'm going to do that same technique, corner to corner. Can you see that from where you are? Is that really hard to see? let me just zoom in a bit actually. Corner to corner. And then from the center, you might want to try and eyeball where the center of the side is. Draw that center. Again, on the other side, draw that. And this is where things can get a little bit more tricksy because it's at an angle and there's less room for you to draw those marks. So my recommendation, the way that I do it, is I only try to find that second, third mark on the outer, on those corner lines. So something like this maybe is my, I don't know if you can see that very well. Can you see that? So those corner lines, I'm trying to find those thirds. So I'm doing it here, doing it here, and I'm doing it here. And now if I use a new color, I want to connect those shapes, hitting those corners and hitting the flats of that side. And now I have got a fairly reasonable ellipse in perspective, following my grid. And that's what our goal was. And from there, you can draw up from the sides. You can draw up from any point really to create. Did I draw that on a new layer? I hope I did. I didn't. Oh well. A pillar. So for example, let's try and pretend that I did do this on a new layer and we get rid of this. We've got this idea of seeing through, it's a see-through pillar, or we can just erase it. Up to you. And then just have that one edge. But now what we've got, if we turn back on our grid, and turn down the opacity maybe, so we can see, we have got a pillar, in a huge pillar, by the way, in perspective of our grid. Right. So I did kind of gloss over the primitive form. Okay, I'm going to go back to my slides. Okay, so what I wanted to point out to you about primitive forms. Look at this, it's like we're taking a whole 12-week class in 40 minutes. With primitive forms, with these cubes, what we can start to do is kind of hit them at a detail level. So we can start to do things like use the faces to extrude from them, as if we were thinking in a 3D sense, to create new and complex forms. We can shave off corners, we can bevel corners, because we've already laid all the information there. We've got those perspective lines. So for example, this beveling cube, this with a beveled edge, that's what that corner is, a bevel. We've got the same face lines, except we've just shaved off that little corner. Very easy, right? And then erase what wasn't there. With the bevel, with the rounded bevel, we've got just shaving off those corners in an eyeballed round way. So we can start to really play with detail using those primitive forms as our base. Was that the only slide? Yeah. Okay, so freehanding our primitive forms. An exercise that I want you all to do now, because we do have a bit of time, is to freehand primitive forms radiating from a focal point. It sounds a little bit complicated. That's why I've left this image up here. What are you doing? Okay. So try for the cube for now. That's what I want you to focus on, just the cube. If it helps, make one face slightly different tone so that you can actually visualize how it's moving, how it's tracking from that point. But you can visualize how all of those lines are converging on a focal point way off in the center. Hi. Yeah, sure, Cece. I am going to be talking though. Okay, so squares, start with the cubes for now, please. You might only get time to do the cubes, but again, I will find a spot and put all these resources because they are really, really beneficial exercises just to go through every now and then, refamiliarize yourself with freehanding perspective and getting your construction ready. These are a little shabby because I did them in class very quickly, but you can make yours look really neat. The other one that I've got at the bottom is it's spinning. So that's why that one looks weird. It's kind of tumbling, yeah? Yeah, using the grid could be a really good way to do it. If you're feeling like you want to fall back on those really defined construction lines, absolutely, we can do that together. If you feel like you're ready to freehand it, go for it. But how about we do an example with the grid? Yeah, let's do that. Okay, so I really hope this recorded. Right. Let's make a grid. So we've got our maybe focal point over here. So we're essentially working in 1 point perspective for this exercise. I'm going to draw out from there. And maybe what I'll do is a series of kind of ellipses to get a little bit more of an idea of a ground plane. That is wonky as, but I don't really care. I'm going to just turn down that opacity a little. And what we can do from here is approximate using my guides. Maybe instead of a vertical line, I'm going to start with that baseline. And then I'm going to make a face for all of these. And you see how I'm drawing that top line to be parallel to my bottom so that they are going towards that same point. So that's what I'm going to do with these ones. And then I'm going to finish them off so that they're faces. And I'm just going to draw vertically, kind of roughly, without too much accuracy, but that still looks pretty good. Now we can do those interior angles that are going towards that vanishing point, and we can use that grid as our reference. So if I'm using this line, for example, I'm going to have these ones heading that way. Can start to get these ones also tracking along. I'm always in my mind using that grid as I draw, heading back. Do it with that bottom line. Easy. And then we finish off that face that we've now established by drawing down and whacking that back one. So the cube is fairly easy once you start to get all this construction in mind and set yourself up ready to go. Now what you can do is draw a new, do a new tone on one of the faces if you want to. Make it a little bit more pretty. And we now have time to cover shadows. So obviously your scenes are going to have light in them, or your objects will have light hitting them. What we can do is use the perspective to create accuracy, but we can be really playful with it. So your light source, whether that's a sun, a bulb, fire, is a vanishing point. So think of your light source as its own vanishing point, specifically when it comes to lighting. So say we have a sun over there. What we can do, if I make a new layer, my preferred method is to use a lasso tool, which I just noticed I went to, but I'm going to not do that because that's hard to see. I'm just going to eyeball it. So with the light source established, we know that all of these faces are going, well, the ones behind are going to be hit with light, so they won't be in shadow. The ones that will be in shadow are these ones here. So we can start by plotting in that just so that our minds are aware of it. But what we want to do is establish that vanishing point. So my vanishing point is there. My line will come from there for my shadow. And then I can use my cubes line, this one here, to establish where that light will terminate. Unless you want a softer fall off, and in that case, we'll get to that later. And using that vanishing point to hit where I approximate that corner to finish, I can see that it'll hit there and that the line will continue. So the face, this is where it gets a little bit confusing, but the face will obscure light. So I actually should have done it from that point, if that makes sense. I don't really know how to say it in words, but just through study, you'll start to see that line. So I'm going to use that same direction for terminating that shadow. So hitting it there, erase that, don't need it. And this is the shadow now for this cube. If I'm just ignoring that other one, by the way. So that's a little bit more of a harder concept to wrap around because you've already established perspective rules, but we're using them still, but not all of them, because we've got a new vanishing point to pay attention to. But we're still using the vanishing point information that went that way. Sweet, okay. Okay, we need to move on. Contour and solid drawing. So, contour, where did you go? Okay, here we go. Contouring. We got you to do contouring in 200 level. In fact, we might have even got you to do Imagine, I think. Yeah, we did. Contouring can be used to help us with our solid drawing. So solid drawing, this is an example of what that means. It is drawing that can be stylized or realistic, but it behaves in a way that the construction is believable. And we can do that through contour lines and primitive forms. How do I talk about this? This is a really hard one to kind of describe. Solid drawing is essentially breaking down forms to their essence in order to add detail later, to give personality and everything. So this is a classic example from a book that I can't remember the name of, but what we can do with our solid drawing, because depending on what you're doing, you can just use contour lines to help you establish the depth and the form and the volume of the shape in order to create those believable solid drawings that come off of it. For example, a torso that then had the correct placement of shoulder pockets. Alternatively, if we wanted to get a little bit more geometric, say if you're working in an environment design, you know, just looking around the room, we've got a contour line happening through this weird detail. It is following the form all the way across, that weird divot that you see. So we can apply contour lines that follow the perspective we've established in our primitive forms. It's a bit easier to see on a cube, which is why I've put it here, but you can absolutely do the same thing with more complex shapes, such as curved shapes, triangles, cones. They will all behave in that same way that you've established. Okay, we have a few quick minutes to talk about the last point. Sorry if this seems a little bit scattered. Line weight. So, as you may already know, we can use line weight to communicate how close something is to us. So say we have got me right here, super stoked to be alive. That's a thumbs up, by the way. Cool. So we've got our foreground element. And the way that we know this is through the line weight. So say we've got something way off in the distance, like me, my clone. We can change the line weight to be much thinner. How do I do an upside down thumb? That's me over there, because even though this is the same thing, the line weight is communicating that it's in a different spot. In fact, that example will work a lot better if I actually make them the same scale. So if this is me, the line weight, this is a terrible example, but the line weight makes it feel like it's closer, even though they're the same scale. Do you kind of see that, even though the drawing is so terrible? Yeah. Yeah, it does. It doesn't look a little bit like that, because that's exactly how I feel. That's fine. I believe that. Okay, so that was our quick fire go through of drawing basics. Like I said at the beginning, which I'm sorry those of you on Zoom didn't hear this preface, these are purely tools that you can use to strengthen your drawing, but it'll only strengthen it if you practice it. You have to apply these rules and techniques actively. When you're drawing, you need to make sure that you are keeping track of your perspective by using things like grids, and it will all start to become second nature, and you won't even have to think about it as you draw anymore. So the other example that I had in that class that I wanted to show you, one of the exercises we did after a few weeks was to draw things freehand just by using those vanishing point rules. So we made things like really awfully designed trucks and houses that don't have any windows, but you get it, right? You can use these tools, primitive forms, perspective, even line weight. If we look at that approximation of a tree, and what was the other one? Contour. So the contours are these internal lines that are on the faces. The contours are how we established how to create those divots, those extrusions, and all those things. And especially important when we're considering round forms that don't have a flat face. So practice those. What I'll do is I'll gather this complete anarchy of resources, and I'll put them in a folder for you. You can follow along with those exercises. And like I said, repeat them every now and then. Give them another go when you're feeling like you have no idea what to draw, or that you're feeling rusty, you need to warm up. This is a great warm-up exercise. Another great warm-up exercise, just super quick, is to draw ellipses over and over again. You can create some really fun things, and it also, as we all established, ellipses was the hardest thing to kind of work on. So just freehanding some ellipses, this example in particular, it can't really zoom in, but what it is, hold on, I did draw it, is you're using a vanishing point. So this line that's through here, that's a horizon line, sorry, not a vanishing point, it's a horizon line, and I'm making the ellipse face become more revealed as you go around. That could be a fun exercise to do. And this one has a horizon line over here, and they're all trickling down. These are just really good exercises to get you warmed up. That is the end of the clinic because it's 1 o'clock and we have to go. I hope you found that helpful. You can all leave now. See ya. Huh? I'm not clear. All good. See ya. All good, Jess. I'm going to turn off the Zoom now. Hopefully that recording worked. See you later.